Welcome back, WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. It's my birthday week around here. It's going to get interesting with the merging of the streams of WNST and Baltimore Positive. Luke Jones is holding on for dear life and just happy the Orioles are not in the American League Championship Series because it would have complicated things this week, right?
Yeah, a little bit, I guess. Although I wouldn't have been going to the bubble anyway, so we'd just be watching it from home.
You know, before we sit down and even talk about what was a garden variety 27-3 victory over the Cincinnati Bengals, right before we sat down, it occurred to me that both New York football teams are 0-5, and the Yankees got eliminated in the fifth game last week. So for little things here during the plague, you know what I mean? Like little things that my dad would be happy
about. It is the little
about
things.
For 1969. But, the Browns appear to be better than we thought. The Steelers are certainly, in that position that we expected them to be in, buy or no buy, and we'll see them in a couple of weeks if they don't change the schedule again. But I expected more from the Cincinnati Bengals, and I know you did too. And we talked all week long, and I had all my usual suspects on from Cincinnati. And then the game started, and that kid looked overwhelmed. I mean, I was kind of shocked that he looked closer to Spurgeon Wynn than he did to Joe Burrow.
Yeah, I think you're right. And yeah, probably pump the brakes a little bit on the Cincinnati Bengals. I would say that they're back, but they have never really been anything other than, for five years with Andy Dalton, and certainly give Marvin Lewis credit for taking them to heights they hadn't been in a long time, but it was still modest. But you're right. I thought this was going to be not a game that necessarily you're sweating in the final 3 minutes, but I thought it would be relatively interesting over the course of the game. And I mean, think back to last year's game in Baltimore. Bengals returned the opening kickoff, and even though the Ravens dominated statistically, when you look at total yards and time of possession and all those different statistics that you go beyond the score, it was a one-score game. And it was a game where the Ravens were still holding their breath a little bit, even though you felt throughout that they were in control and going to win. We didn't see anything like that. And you're right. I mean, with Joe Burrow, who I still am very high on, but what was the one thing that we talked about, and I know various guests that you talked about over the course of the week, that offensive line and the inability to protect him. And to this point, or until Sunday, I should say, he had held up well. He had 3 straight 300-yard games, and a major credit to him, and shows to the ability he has. But if you're a team that struggles to protect your young quarterback, and then you're going up against this defense, and for as much as we can talk about Patrick Mahomes and blitzing him or not blitzing him, which is probably what they need to do, the latter is what they need to do the next time they face him, this is a defense that loves to send pressure. They love to mix up their looks. They love to show man coverage, and then they'll move into zone or vice versa. I mean, they will do everything they possibly can to try to deceive and confuse you. And when you're talking about a rookie quarterback, that's a big enough challenge in and of itself. And then when you have an offensive line that has shown no consistent ability to protect him, we probably should have seen that coming a little bit more. And I think what's interesting, Nestor, is what have we been talking about week after week? We focused on the offense, waiting for it to look like that well-oiled machine it was last year. And we'll get to the offense, because there were certainly things we could talk about that weren't all that impressive on that side of the ball after the first quarter. But this was the kind of defensive effort we saw from mid-October on last year. So as much as we were talking about the fact that, okay, it hasn't looked overly dominant, at least compared to what it looked like last year, even though the Ravens are 3-1. They were only 2-2 at this point going into Sunday's game last year. And trying to look at it from that lens, I think it was a reminder that that defense had a lot of issues. And in fact, one guy that they caught up with before the game, Josh Bynes, playing for that Bengals defense, was one of the guys they brought in to help stabilize things, because it was looking like it was going to go sideways at the end of September. I mean, with some of the issues they had at linebacker, some of the injuries they had endured in the secondary, and then we saw them just take off. And as much as the focus is inevitably going to be on Lamar Jackson, when he's the MVP of the league, and you're setting records as a rushing attack, and you have all these guys making Pro Bowls, there was also the defense playing like a top 3, if not better, unit over the second half of 2019. And what we saw on Sunday against a rookie quarterback and a poor offensive line, that defense completely overwhelmed them, and the game wasn't competitive as a result.
Well, and I think from the beginning, you looked at it and said, all right, well, they're going to send some pressure on him. Is he going to make bad throws? Is he going to give the ball away? And that was kind of the part that surprised me. That's why I compare him to Spurgeon Wynn or any other purgative I could pick up from any other quarterback, Ryan Mallett, even though he won a big game, as we talked about last week. But I just thought the sloppiness of throwing the ball. Hey, and Lamar threw the ball 3-4 times.
Sure.
He made really bad un-Lamar passes, the kind of passes he went a month without throwing last year.
Frankly, the kind of passes that he threw as a rookie, and the only difference was he wasn't running for 130 yards on Sunday.
Sure.
But with Joe Burrow, look, he was under pressure a lot. The few times he got enough time, the Ravens were covering Cincinnati's wide receivers. I mean, A.J. Green was a non-factor, left the game with the hamstring issue. I mean, he has not been his old self whatsoever. I think that's been evident based on what you've seen and what you've heard from Cincinnati over the first month of the season. And Marlon Humphrey really did a nice job locking down Tyler Boyd, who has really been Burrow's number one receiver. I mean, he wasn't much of a factor, made a few catches, but held him under 50 yards receiving, which, by the way, was one of my predictions for Sunday. So even though I got the score wrong and I thought it was going to be a closer game, I at least felt good about that. But I think you just saw a Ravens defense that, Kansas City, a game aside, had been really, really good in the other three games, but we had still seen some deficiencies. Most recently, the inability to cover running backs out of the backfield as receivers. I mean, they'd given up 200 receiving yards to running backs over the last 2 weeks, but they just across the board played incredibly sound isn't even the right word. It was terrific football across the board, what they did defensively. And like I said, as much as we're still waiting and we'll continue to wait to see this offense look like the well-oiled machine that it was last year, that defense, what we saw on Sunday, was as dominant as what we were seeing in the second half of last season. I mean, the offense gets the attention. I mean, offense sells tickets, right? I mean, you have an MVP at quarterback last year. So, yeah, the attention was on them, and we can remember what happened in the first month of the season last year. And then they bring in Josh Bynes and LJ Ford. They bring in Marcus Peters. They get Jimmy Smith back from injury, and that defense just took off. So while we'll certainly talk about the offense and talk about Lamar Jackson and really with a unit that I think, frankly, is lacking an identity 5 games into the season, it hasn't been bad, but it's been disjointed and it hasn't been that well-oiled machine that we talked about it being last year, where they just dominated teams. I mean, just ran them out of the stadium. They were just killing them. So while we'll continue to wait for that and ask questions about that, I thought Sunday was a reminder of not just how good this defense is, but how great it can be. And yes, I understand. We'll talk about the pass rush. Certainly that comes up when they're playing a team like Kansas City. In a perfect world, yeah, you'd love to get more from a 4-man rush. And I suspect Eric DeCosta will be exploring over the next few weeks opportunities to boost that pass rush. But for one game anyway, 7 sacks. And how about this, Nestor? 5 of those 7 sacks coming from members of the secondary. It just, again, speaks to how exotic the kind of defense Wink Martindale wants to play, with blitzes and zone coverage, guys dropping in the zone blitzes and things of that nature. And then you have Marlon Humphrey coming off the corner, or you have Chuck Clark blitzing, or Deshaun Elliott blitzing. I mean, that's the style of defense, frankly, the Ravens need to play, because they don't have that Terrell Suggs and Elvis Dumerville lining up on the edges. They have to create pressure. They have to scheme pressure instead of just relying on a 4-man rush. So when it's going really well,
Wink's alley, though, right? I mean,
right,
Lapham
sure.
and Horde had me on their podcast. Know the Foe was the name of their podcast, and they asked me about Wink and pinning back his ears, and I said I think the ghost of Buddy Ryan's always in his ear. Send heat, send it off the edge. You won't see, and if you have guys. I mean, look, it's a tribute to the pressure. It's obviously an issue for the offensive line for the Bengals, which was overwhelmed. A young quarterback that couldn't see it, didn't feel it. But more than that, when you send them and they get there, oh, my God, right? Like,
oh, sure.
Now that's one more thing that Pittsburgh has to worry about a couple weeks from now, that Philadelphia's going to have to worry about all week as we go up there beyond the cheesesteaks and the pretzels and all that stuff. Luke Jones is here, Baltimore Luke at WNST.net. You talk about the Humphrey, you talk about Peters, the ball strip thing and ball security in the league. Look, it's really nice to have a 3-and-out, slap them down defense, put them in 3rd and long, sack them, all of that stuff. But when you're taking the ball away, it's a whole different game.
Oh, no question about it. And I'm glad you brought that up because we've talked about this, and we've talked about this a lot over the last couple of years. You don't see interceptions at the same rate that you used to see them even 10 years ago, let alone 20 or 25 years ago when we're talking about Ray Lewis and Dwayne Starks and Chris McAllister and Rod Woodson in the secondary. I mean, you just don't see quarterbacks have gotten so much better with, I don't even know if they're better protecting the ball, but just the style of offense. They get the ball out quick. I think clearly the rules pander to the offenses, so you can't play the same kind of physical defense in the secondary that leads to more turnovers. So even though Marlon Humphrey, I mean, he had an interception in week 1, but when you have an ability to strip the ball away from the offensive player, I mean, that is a weapon. And that's something I can tell you, going back to 5-6 years ago, when some of those Dean Pease defenses that statistically looked pretty good, but they weren't creating turnovers. And we can talk about the issues. We know the secondary certainly was a far cry from what it is now. You can talk about the lack of consistency with the pass rush, but they would play that bend but don't break style, which works a lot. And it's not to say they didn't win games and they didn't have good defenses then, but it's really been a major point of emphasis for them. I can think back to the last 4 or 5 years at training camp, the amount of practice that you see the defensive players have in trying to take the football away. And I mean, it's something you have to be disciplined because you can't solely go for the strip because you miss a tackle. Then there you go. I mean, you're talking about a potential 50-yard play, touchdown, what have you. But to have the kind of defense that they're able to play where, in Humphrey's case, he tackles like a linebacker as it is, so he can wrap a guy up and then go for the strip. Or in most cases with these guys, first guy wraps, second guy is going for the football. And the Ravens just have had so much success with that. And clearly Humphrey leading the way. Pretty remarkable when you look at it. And I know, Pernell McPhee, Patrick Queen talked about it after the game. You saw so many players on Twitter on Sunday evening talking about Marlon Humphrey as Defensive Player of the Year. I mean, we're only 5 weeks in, and Stephon Gilmore aside, and Charles Woodson aside, several years back, you typically don't see corners be Defensive Player of the Year. But in the Ravens' 4 wins, Marlon Humphrey has a takeaway in each of those 4 games, whether it's an interception or a forced fumble that the Ravens got back. So it is such a valuable commodity. And anyone will tell you, and the Ravens, they're big into analytics. You win the turnover battle, I believe you're up around 80% of the time you're winning the game when you win the turnover battle. So is there randomness and luck involved in it? Sure, no question about it. But when you have the ability to consistently rip the ball away from the opposition, I mean, it is just going to improve your chances to win football games tremendously. Not necessarily a game like Sunday where it wasn't all that close. It wasn't close at all, really. But in those closer games, those tight games, those one-score games, those takeaways, I mean, I'm stating the obvious here, but they're so good at doing it, you can't help but point out how big of an advantage that gives them.
Well, you don't win 45-6 on the road in L.A. without taking the ball away a little. I mean, that's how they get these wild scores. And even on a 27-3 day, you'd say, well, then they must have ran it a little bit or threw it a little bit or played. No, not really. I mean, this is going to be the week where we start to scratch our heads about the offense. And look, we knew the rubber band. We knew the defense was going to catch up. Defenses were going to catch up to some degree with what Lamar is doing. And then Lamar gets injured. It's the middle of the season. We could kind of expect this when he runs into contact, that there are going to be weeks where he's going to be a hot tub club guy. You know what I mean? Like, he's just going to have to be, especially as he gets older. He's still young. As I get older this week, Luke, and you got older a couple of weeks ago, this is part of this is, him running around 16, 18 times and taking on heat in games. That's going to be for the games when we're struggling, not for the games when you're up 14-0 quickly.
Yeah, and lots of discussion about the offense after the game, obviously. And sitting in the press box, I can tell you there were a number of occasions. I don't know how well the telecast picked up on it necessarily, but there was some frustration. I mean, at one point, I remember Lamar Jackson just kind of blowing right by James Urban. Not that those two were having a personal spat or anything like that, but clearly just some frustration that the offense just wasn't clicking the way it did. I mean, look at Lamar on Sunday from the time that he threw the touchdown pass to Marquise Brown, first play of the second quarter, 8 of 13, 76 yards, 2 touchdown passes. Not phenomenal numbers, but good numbers, rock solid type numbers. Rest of the game, 11 of 24 for 104 yards and an interception. And as you pointed out, probably should have had a couple other interceptions. I mean, just some very questionable throws that he made. And I think that's where we kind of go back to not so much even putting this on Lamar Jackson, because to your point, missed practice 2 days this week. I don't think he was 100%. I mean, he only ran twice. I think that was evident right there.
That says everything. They
Sure.
said to him, "Don't run.
Yeah,
Don't run. We're playing a bad team. Stand in the pocket. Get rid of the ball. Throw the ball around. Take a grounding. Do whatever you need to do. Don't get hurt this week. We got a week off after next week. We got Pittsburgh after that. We're in good shape." But again, back to the division. The more that Cleveland and Pittsburgh chase them, this thing is, as we get up on my birthday and Halloween and wherever we are, the story to me is the other teams are better than we thought they were going to be, and certainly more competitive, where I think the Ravens are going to run away from the division, but I didn't think they would be in a 3-dog race at this point that it appears to be, where the long tail of Lamar is don't run against the Bengals the first week of October if you can beat them 27-3 running the ball twice.
Yeah, and that's fine. And that's fine. I think the question though becomes, why was he throwing it 28 times in the first half when they had a lead and they had a 17-point lead and they continued to throw the ball?
Because other guys can run the ball too. They have 3 other guys.
And I think that's the question more. So I'm not shocked that Lamar Jackson had a so-so game. Missing that much practice. Let's face it. This passing game hasn't really been clicking the way it did even in week 1 over the last few weeks. Now, last week, they had some very opportune big plays at the right time. A couple big throws. Mark Andrews catches 2 touchdowns. Hollywood Brown had a couple big catches, one right to the goal line to set up a touchdown. So, but we haven't seen the same consistency. You look at the yards per attempt; it's down. On Sunday, the completion percentage, right around 50%. I mean, that's not what you have come to expect, and that's a compliment to Lamar Jackson. Let's be very clear about that. We saw what he was able to do last year, but I've talked about this a lot. You do look at how they profiled last year. I heard a lot of people talking about the fact that they were 31st in passing yards per game going into week 5. Well, they were only 27th in that department last year. This is not a volume passing game, and I don't think is going to continue to. I don't think it's going to become one anytime soon. I feel like they're trying to do that as much as they can.
I was going to say, nor should they try to make it
to their detriment. Right. But the point is, last year, it wasn't the volume. I mean, Lamar Jackson didn't throw for 5,000 yards or anything like that last year. It was the efficiency. I've cited this over and over. 9% of his pass attempts last year were touchdown passes. Tom Brady's never done that in a season. So it just speaks to the just sensational efficiency that they found last year. And I said it, and I've said it, wrote it before the season. We've talked about it. We talked about it before the season. We've talked about it the last couple of weeks. Inevitably, yeah, I expected some regression to the mean in that way. I certainly didn't expect Lamar Jackson to lead the league in touchdown passes again, based on if they were going to throw a comparable number of times. But you do want to find more efficiency. We're still seeing, okay, Mark Andrews is getting his. Marquise Brown is getting his, kind of, sort of, not always, but caught his first touchdown of the season on Sunday. But where's that third option? I don't know what it is right now. Could it be Devin Duvernay? At some point, sure. It feels like they're working him in there a little bit more. Had the nice end-around run. You certainly like the speed, but to have that third steady option at wide receiver, and look, I mean, this is not a unique problem for the Baltimore Ravens. How many years have we talked about them not having a legitimate first and second option in some years, let alone a third? But if you're really trying to grow this passing game and maintain that same level of efficiency, it can't just be Lamar Jackson throwing to Marquise Brown and Mark Andrews all the time. I know Jesse Bates, the standout safety for the Bengals, talked about it after the game, that they know when the Ravens are throwing the ball, it's going to Andrews or Marquise Brown. Now, you would say counterpoint is, well, they each caught a touchdown, so they didn't do the best job in stopping them, but we saw by and large that passing game not clicking the way it needed to. And I know people will clamor for them to run the ball more, and I hear that, and I don't even disagree with that, but we keep talking about where this offense was last year, where it is right now, and ultimately where they want to go. And
Well, you
that
took
is
Hayden Hurst out. You took Marshall Yonda out, right? Let's
right.
start with that.
Sure. Well,
And you've decided Ingram's going to be have less of a role, right?
I mean, I have no idea what to make of their running game at this point. And it's not even that it's been that bad. I mean, look at the yards per carry, and Gus Edwards going into the week was averaging over 6 yards per carry, and
But
we
the
saw
way they
Lamar have his
did this
50-yard.
was handoff left, handoff right, being 2nd and 2, 2nd and 3, use the clock. That's what they did the last 2 years. They haven't really done that the first 5 weeks,
No,
right? So we haven't seen that flow.
Second half of the Houston game was the only time we've seen that. Right.
Fair enough.
You're totally right about that, but it does become so. And you see, even with the number of carries, and Ingram ended up with 11 carries on Sunday. I think that was a new high for the season for any Ravens running back. 5 games into the season, Nestor, if I had told you that going into week 1, that would have been a little surprising, I would think. And part of this does come back to, as you mentioned, no Marshall Yonda. Hayden Hurst, while he wasn't a Nick Boyle level of blocker, still was a factor as far as them running a lot of 12 personnel.
He was the guy you had to worry about catching the ball, as they're finding out in Atlanta, right?
And that's what factored in as well. You're running a lot of 12 personnel, and you're thinking, okay, are they going to run the ball here? But, oh, my goodness, they have these 2 tight ends that can go out there and catch passes over the middle. So you've changed the dynamics a little bit. And I'm not criticizing the trade, but it changed their personnel. It changed up their identity a little bit. And then you add J.K. Dobbins into the mix, who I still have very high hopes for and high expectations for. Had a really impressive run on Sunday, even though he didn't get the ball a whole lot. But now you have another mouth to feed, so to speak. And I still remember draft night when the Ravens drafted J.K. Dobbins, and everyone's going nuts. And look, it was great value. End of the second round for a guy who profiled the way he did at Ohio State. I'm not going to argue with that pick, but my 2020 concern was there's only one football to go around. So, we've talked about the passing game, the rushing attack. At times, like what we saw on Sunday, they don't seem overly inclined to really get that going to the same degree, and maybe that's deliberate. Maybe they're, as we talked about late last week, maybe there's something to the idea of you got to work on this passing game because we can keep talking about them being down 2 scores. That doesn't happen very often, and you got to practice that and develop that, and you can only do so much of that in practice. So maybe there is something to the fact that not that they're not putting their best foot forward, but they are trying to grow. They are trying to diversify a little bit. They're trying to evolve a little bit in the same way they talked about the evolution last year, or the revolution, whatever they were calling it. But there is something to the idea of when your running backs are only getting 7, 8, 9, maybe on the high end, 10 or 11 carries per game, that's tough to really get into a rhythm that way. And that's not to say that they should just give Gus Edwards 30 carries and be done with it, or give Mark Ingram 25 carries and be done with it. But there have been some times over the last few weeks where someone carries the ball and it looks pretty good, and then they're coming out of the game and someone else is coming in. And I love the depth. I love the fact that you have 3 running backs that you feel you can do some damage with. But I think in addition to talking about no Marshall Yonda, and 2 different guys rotating at right guard, and Ronnie Stanley missed last week's game, for example, there are a lot of moving parts, and they just, at times it's just felt disjointed. This hasn't been a bad offense. Let's be very clear about that. I mean, we've been very much spoiled over the last 2 calendar years.
Yeah, I was getting ready to say, we're bitching about a 27-3 victory here.
Yeah.
Things weren't perfect. Okay,
But we still have to talk about it, though,
But the
because it is
defense isn't
relevant.
supposed to overshadow the offense around here.
Oh, but it was a good reminder, though, of just how damn good the defense was last year. And they were overshadowed a lot because of the fact that you're scoring 40 or 50 points in some of these games. So they're still searching for it on offense. And to your point, and they scored 20 points on offense. I mean, of course, they had the fumble recovery return by Patrick Queen to get to 27. But I think it is. I think they are searching for what their identity is going to be, and there's certainly things you can look at for the run game and the passing game right now to try to ask questions and figure out how that's going to look. But I can't say I'm surprised based on the fact that it had kind of been a beat or two off anyway, and then Lamar Jackson misses 2 games or two days of practice, I should say, and you had some rain as the day went on as well. So I wasn't shocked to see them not light up the scoreboard, but when you have a defense playing at an elite level, a defense that, if not for the fact that Zach Taylor just wanted to kick a field goal just to save the embarrassment of being shut out, I suppose. I mean, that's kind of the only reason to do that. A team that, for all intents and purposes, they pitched a shutout as far as meaningful football on Sunday. So you'll take that, and I think it's important to recognize, and we'll talk more about what happened elsewhere around the league. But you see what happened to Kansas City at home against what people all assume an inferior opponent. So they drop a game. And I'll also point out what happened to Dallas with Dak Prescott. And you're reminded that, when Lamar Jackson's knee is a little cranky, you want to be careful there. And just how quickly fortunes can change for a football team. And the Cowboys are experiencing that. So, no, it hasn't been as dominant, as perfect as the 2019 Ravens looked in the second half of the season, but they're 4-1, and they're still in great position, in great shape. Still have a lot of playmakers on both sides of the ball, and I still have every bit of confidence they're going to figure it out. And to your point, before even thinking about Kansas City or January, got to think a little bit about the AFC North, because Pittsburgh, they've been impressive, and Ben Roethlisberger even pushing the ball down the field a little bit on Sunday against an Eagles team that's not particularly good, but you have them, and the Cleveland Browns have certainly looked much better than they did against the Ravens in Week 1. So it's very much looking like it's not going to be that run away and win the division by 6 games like it was last year for the Ravens.
Luke will be watching baseball all week while monitoring all things Philadelphia. I will be in Philadelphia on Sunday eating tasty cakes and pretzels and cheesesteaks and getting up down I-95 this week. Luke will be in Owings Mills. All of our WNST coverage brought to you by our friends at Coons Ford Security Boulevard. Don't forget, Dennis Colatzos will be here on Thursday from 3 until 5 as we have merged the streams of WNST.net and Baltimore Positive. Big thanks to all of our sponsors, the new website, Chris and Christopher throwing it together. It's going to be a big week around here. We had Nancy Pelosi on, a Speaker of the House, as well as Dutch Rupersberger. We went all throughout Maryland here this week talking to elected leaders and officials and talking to folks about voting. And this is the point in the program where I remind you that Lucas lives in Pennsylvania, which is a really important state, and Maryland, which, well, we're important too, but we know how things are going to go here because we're sane in Maryland. If you're in Pennsylvania, be sane and vote. How's that, Luke? Was that a good public service announcement?
There you go.
We are WNST.net, AM 1570, Taos in Baltimore, and we never stop talking American freedom and Baltimore Positive.